It is a hatred that predates most modern nations, a prejudice that has outlived empires and ideologies. Before the world spoke of concepts like nationalism or racial theory, before the rise of Christianity and Islam, the seeds of a unique and persistent animosity were being sown. This animosity would prove to be unnervingly adaptable, capable of changing its mask to fit any era, any political climate, and any societal anxiety. It has been called the oldest hatred, a poison that has seeped into the foundations of Western civilization and beyond, responsible for centuries of persecution, exile, and culminating in an attempt at total annihilation. The question is not merely what this hatred is, but why it has endured with such chilling tenacity. Why, for over 2,000 years, have the Jewish people been the object of such intense and varied forms of loathing? The answer is a deeply uncomfortable journey through the darkest corridors of human history, psychology, and politics. This is a story that needs to be told, and understanding it is more critical now than ever. If you believe in the importance of confronting difficult truths and learning from the past to build a better future, then take a moment to support this channel. Please press the like button and subscribe, so we can continue to explore these crucial topics together. Your support makes these deep dives possible. To begin to unravel this complex tapestry of hate, we must travel back to a time when the world was governed by a pantheon of gods. In the vast Roman Empire, religious tolerance was largely a matter of practicality. Conquered peoples could worship their own deities, as long as they paid homage to the Roman gods and, crucially, to the deified emperor. It was a system of religious syncretism that kept the sprawling empire relatively stable. Yet one group stood apart: the Jews. Their fierce, uncompromising monotheism was not just a theological curiosity, it was a direct challenge to the Roman way of life. They refused to bow before Roman idols or acknowledge the emperor as a god. To the Romans, this wasn't just piety. It was insubordination, a stubborn separatism that bred suspicion. They were seen as clannish, aloof, and disdainful of others. This perception of otherness, this idea of a people who lived by a different set of rules, was the fertile ground in which the first seeds of anti-Jewish sentiment were planted. It was not yet the racial or religious anti-Semitism we know today, but a form of xenophobia, a distrust of a people who refused to transform this suspicion into a foundational doctrine of hatred emerged from within Judaism itself. The birth of Christianity, a faith that began as a Jewish sect, would create a theological schism with devastating and long-lasting consequences. As the new religion sought to define itself and spread throughout the Roman Empire, it needed to distinguish itself from its parent faith. A narrative began to form, one that placed the blame for the crucifixion of Jesus squarely on the shoulders of the Jewish people. The Gospels were interpreted to create a damning charge, that of deicide, the killing of God. This accusation, that the Jews were collectively and eternally responsible for the death of the Christian Savior, would become the cornerstone of Christian anti-Semitism for nearly 2 millennia. It was a spiritual justification for hatred, elevating it from mere social prejudice to a matter of divine retribution. The Jewish people were no longer just seen as stubborn outsiders, they were cast as the villains in the central drama of the Christian faith, a people cursed by God and condemned to wander the earth as punishment for their ultimate sin. With the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of Christendom in Europe, this theological animosity became codified into law and social practice. The Church, now the dominant political and cultural force, enacted a series of measures designed to isolate and humiliate the Jewish population. Jews were forbidden from owning land, excluding them from the feudal agricultural economy. They were barred from joining guilds, cutting them off from most skilled trades. They were forced to live in segregated areas, which would later become known as ghettos. In some regions, they were compelled to wear distinctive clothing, such as pointed hats or yellow badges, marking them as outcasts. This systematic exclusion had an unintended and ironic consequence. With most professions closed to them, Jews were pushed into one of the few economic roles available: money lending. Christian doctrine at the time forbade usury, the lending of money at interest, among Christians. This created an economic vacuum that Jews were permitted, and in some cases forced, to fill. While this provided a vital service for developing economies, it also created a new and powerful stereotype: the greedy Jewish moneylender who profited from the misfortune of Christians. This caricature would prove incredibly durable, fueling resentment and providing a convenient scapegoat during times of economic hardship. The Middle Ages saw this simmering hatred erupt into horrific violence. The Crusades, holy wars intended to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule, began with the slaughter of Jewish communities along the Rhine. The Crusaders reasoned that before fighting the enemies of Christ abroad, they should first punish the killers of Christ at home. This period also saw the birth of one of the most grotesque and persistent anti-Semitic myths: the blood libel. This was the baseless and monstrous accusation that Jews murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals, particularly for making matzah for Passover. The first recorded case, that of William of Norwich in 1144 in England, set a terrifying precedent. Despite a complete lack of evidence, the story spread like wildfire, leading to the torture, forced confession, and mass execution of countless Jews across Europe for centuries. It was a potent form of psychological warfare, painting Jews not just as religious outsiders but as inhuman monsters capable of the most heinous acts. This dehumanization made it easier to justify persecution and violence against them. Entire communities were expelled from lands England had expelled its Jewish population in 1290, France in 1394, and most famously, Spain in 1492 with the Alhambra Decree, forcing them to convert to Catholicism or leave. This era cemented the image of the Jew as a permanent alien, a wanderer with no true home, forever subject to the whims of Christian rulers. The dawn of the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries promised a new age of reason. One might expect that this would have spelled the end of a prejudice so deeply rooted in religious superstition. For a time, it seemed so. Many of the old restrictions on Jews were lifted, and they were gradually granted civil rights in many parts of Western Europe, a process known as emancipation. However, the very forces that dismantled the old religious justifications for anti-Semitism were simultaneously forging a new, and in many ways more dangerous, form of this hatred. The Enlightenment's emphasis on science and classification, combined with the rise of nationalism, created a new prism through which to view humanity: race. Suddenly, being Jewish was no longer just a matter of religious belief. It was a matter of blood, an immutable biological trait. This new scientific or racial anti-Semitism argued that Jews were not just followers of a different faith, but a distinct and inferior race with inherent negative qualities that were once condemned on religious grounds. Clannishness, greed, deceptiveness were now repackaged as unchangeable racial traits. This was a pernicious shift. A Jew could escape religious persecution by converting to Christianity, but how could one change their race? This new ideology meant that even a Jew who had converted, or whose family had converted generations ago, was still fundamentally and irrevocably a Jew, and therefore inherently this racial theory dovetailed perfectly with the rise of 19th-century nationalism. As European nations began to forge strong, unified national identities based on shared language, ethnicity, and culture, the Jews were once again cast as the ultimate outsiders. They were portrayed as a nation within a nation, a cosmopolitan people with international ties whose loyalty to their host country was questionable. They were the eternal alien who could never truly be French, German, this suspicion was weaponized by political movements that sought to define their nations in exclusionary, ethnic terms. Jews became the convenient internal enemy against which a nation could define its own purity. It was in this toxic brew of racial science and aggressive nationalism that the most infamous anti-Semitic forgery in history was born. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. First appearing in Tsarist Russia in the early 20th century, this fabricated text purported to be the minutes of a secret meeting of Jewish leaders plotting to achieve world domination. It described in lurid detail a vast, centuries-old conspiracy to subvert Christian civilization, control global finance, manipulate the media, and install a Jewish world government. Despite being definitively exposed as a crude plagiarism and a hoax, the Protocols became an international bestseller. It was translated into dozens of languages and was presented as undeniable proof of a sinister Jewish cabal. It gave a clear, simple, and terrifying explanation for all the complex and unsettling changes of the modern world, from wars and revolutions to economic depressions. For the anti-Semite, every crisis could now be traced back to the secret machinations of this Jewish conspiracy. The Protocols provided a complete worldview of hate, a warrant for the persecution, and ultimately, the extermination of a people framed as the enemies of all humanity. The 20th century saw all these poisonous streams of hatred, the ancient religious condemnation, the economic resentment, the racial pseudoscience, and the conspiratorial paranoia, converge into a catastrophic tidal wave. In the aftermath of Germany's defeat in World War I and the subsequent economic devastation, a political party emerged that harnessed this accumulated anti-Semitism as its central organizing principle. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, did not invent a new form of hatred. Rather, it synthesized and weaponized every anti-Jewish trope and myth that had been festering in European culture for centuries. Their ideology presented history as an epic struggle between the Aryan race and the Jewish race. For the Nazis, the Jew was not merely an inferior, but the absolute antithesis of the Aryan, a parasitic, destructive force responsible for every ill in the world, including capitalism, communism, modern art, and Germany's military defeat. This ideology, relentlessly propagated through mass media, education, and political rallies, systematically dehumanized the Jewish people in the eyes of the German public. They were no longer fellow citizens, neighbors, or colleagues. They were vermin, a plague, a cancer on the body politic that needed to be excised. This process of dehumanization was a necessary prerequisite for what was to come. It began with discriminatory laws, the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which stripped Jews of their citizenship and forbade marriage or relationships between Jews and non-Jews. It escalated to organized violence, like the pogrom of Kristallnacht in 1938, where synagogues were burned and Jewish businesses destroyed. It moved to forced ghettoization and eventually to the final solution, the systematic, industrialized genocide of the Jewish people was not a sudden burst of madness. It was the logical, horrifying culmination of a nearly 2,000-year-old ideology of hate, meticulously planned and executed by a modern state that had placed racial anti-Semitism at its very core. It demonstrated with terrifying clarity where the path of dehumanization and conspiracy ultimately leads. The end of World War II and the revelation of the full scale of the Holocaust's horrors shocked the world. It seemed, for a moment, that anti-Semitism had been so thoroughly discredited that it could never again rear its ugly head in polite society. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 was seen by many as a necessary and just response, providing a sovereign homeland for people who had been persecuted for millennia for their statelessness. However, the old hatred did not disappear. It simply mutated once more, adapting to the new geopolitical landscape. In the post-war era, anti-Semitism has become a more complex and multifaceted phenomenon. On the far right, it continues in its classic forms. White supremacists and neo-Nazis still peddle the old lies of racial inferiority and circulate conspiracy theories about Jewish control, often updated for the digital age. They speak of a Zionist-occupied government, ZOG, and use the internet to spread their toxic ideology to a global audience, finding new recruits in the dark corners of online forums and social media. A newer and more insidious form of anti-Semitism, however, has often emerged from segments of the far left. This form frequently hides behind the guise of anti-Zionism, the opposition to the existence of the State of Israel. It is crucial to distinguish between legitimate criticism of the policies of the Israeli government, which is a normal part of political discourse, and anti-Semitism. The line is crossed when Israel is singled out for condemnation with a ferocity and double standard applied to no other country. It is crossed when the very right of the Jewish people to self-determination is denied, a right afforded to other peoples. It is crossed when classic anti-Semitic tropes are recycled and applied to Zionists or Israelis, for example when they are accused of controlling the media or global finance, or when they are depicted in cartoons using the same grotesque caricatures seen in Nazi propaganda. This form of anti-Semitism holds all Jews worldwide collectively responsible for the actions of the Israeli government and creates an environment where Jewish people in the diaspora are targeted and harassed for their perceived connection to a state thousands of miles away. Furthermore, a specific strain has also taken root in parts of the Muslim world, often blending traditional European anti-Semitic tropes, like the protocols, with local political and religious conflicts. This has created a situation where hatred of Jews is actively promoted in some state-sponsored media and educational systems, framing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict not as a national dispute over land, but as an eternal religious war. In the 21st century, the Internet has acted as a powerful accelerant for all these forms of anti-Semitism. Social media algorithms can trap users in echo chambers of hate, while conspiracy theories spread faster and wider than ever before. Figures like George Soros, a Jewish billionaire and philanthropist, are cast as the central puppet masters in vast globalist conspiracies that are often just updated versions of the plots described in the protocols. The anonymity of the Internet allows this ancient hatred to flourish, connecting disparate groups of extremists and mainstreaming ideas that were once confined to the fringe. So, we return to the core, uncomfortable question. Why? Why this specific people? There is no single, simple answer. The truth is that anti-Semitism is a complex virus of the mind that has survived by being incredibly useful to those who wield it. It offers a simple explanation for a complex world. When faced with economic collapse, political instability, or a terrifying pandemic, it is easier to blame a shadowy cabal of conspirators than to confront the intricate and often impersonal forces at play. The Jewish people, with their long history of being a visible yet stateless minority, became the perfect prepackaged scapegoat. Anti-Semitism also provides a powerful tool for building group identity. By defining who we are against a reviled other, demagogues can forge a sense of unity and purpose, channeling a population's fears and resentments toward an external target. It is a way to create a false sense of moral and intellectual superiority by projecting all of society's sins and anxieties onto a single group. The hatred of Jews has been a central pillar in the ideologies of countless movements because it is so versatile. It can be adapted to blame Jews for capitalism and for communism, for being too insular and for being too cosmopolitan, for being weak and for being secretly all-powerful. This inherent contradiction doesn't matter, because the purpose of the conspiracy theory is not to be logical, but to be emotionally satisfying for the hater. The uncomfortable truth is that this hatred persists because it speaks to some of the darkest impulses of human nature, our tendency toward tribalism, our suspicion of the unfamiliar, our desire for simple answers to hard questions, and our capacity for envy and resentment. It is a multifaceted prejudice, woven from threads of religious dogma, economic jealousy, racial pseudoscience, and political expediency. It is not just the history of the Jewish people. It is a dark mirror reflecting the failures and fears of Western civilization. Understanding this history is not an academic exercise. It is a vital act of self-defense for a civilized world, a reminder that a hatred allowed to fester against one group will eventually threaten all. The story of anti-Semitism is a cautionary tale of how an idea, a lie told often enough, can lead a society down a path of
vigilance against
unimaginable
it, therefore,
barbarity.
is
Is a responsibility for everyone who believes in a common humanity.